Good evening, everyone. I think we're about ready to get started, maybe in just a few seconds here. Glad you're here tonight. I do want to welcome you on behalf of Carthage College. My name is David Timmerman. I'm the provost here. It's my fourth year at Carthage. I've loved every minute of it, and I'm glad to be here with you tonight. I want you to know that we're honored to have this event here. It's consistent with things that we've pursued here at Carthage for a number of years, and you may be familiar, or I want to make sure you're familiar, that in the summer of 2020, our president, John Swallow, put out a plan for anti-racism with multiple parts that we've been pursuing since that time. It includes a number of things for students, including a first-year experience that extends through the first year, other courses that they would take through their time here at Carthage. There's also faculty and staff development as a part of that. We made a commitment to be a part of Braver Angels here at Carthage and in the state of Wisconsin, and you may know and should know that our Cameron Swallow, who's here with us tonight, is the co-director of that for Wisconsin, of Braver Angels, and we have a number of events for Braver Angels on campus, and you could look for those and participate. We'd love to have you be a part of those, and maybe some of you already have been. In preparing for tonight, I was in communication with Rabbi Feingold, and she sent just a brief paragraph that I thought to myself, this sets the stage for us tonight better than anything I could write, and so I have informed her that I'm stealing her words, but that's what I intend to do right now. Thank you. The event, Antisemitism in Our Community, is a response to recent local and national acts of anti-Semitism. Both Racine and Kenosha have been the focus of anti-Semitic acts in the past few years. Vandalism at the Racine Synagogue, Beth Israel Sinai, and anti-Semitism graffiti at the Lutheran High School. In Kenosha, since December of 2021, there have been several distributions of anti-Semitic leaflets in neighborhoods, one as recently as last Friday. Also, high-profile attacks on synagogues throughout the United States in the past few years, including murders in Pennsylvania and California, and a hostage situation in Texas just this year, have raised alarm in the Jewish community and have caused Jewish institutions to increase their security. Community members are upset by these actions. We want to understand who are doing them and where anti-Semitism comes from and what we can do about it and how we can help. And then just even very recently, events in Tel Aviv. So all of these are reasons that we're here tonight, that we have our wonderful panel here to help us. And so I want to thank you and say that Carthage College is honored to be a part of this. So thank you very much.
It's on, right? Okay. Well, we very much want to thank Carthage College for so graciously hosting this evening, and it is being live streamed. So we are so pleased that some of you are watching from home as well. My topic is, who are the Jews? Judaism, along with Christianity and Islam, is one of the world's three great monotheistic religions and the oldest of them. Our story begins with the patriarchs and matriarchs whose stories we read in Genesis. The foundation of Judaism is in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. But reading the Bible alone does not really describe Judaism as we know it today. Judaism developed in the Talmud and related literature that was created in the early centuries of the first millennium. Jews are the people who are connected by faith, heritage, and core values to Judaism. And by the way, it's entirely appropriate to call anyone who has such an identity a Jew. I've noticed that some think it's impolite to say Jew, and use instead Jewish person or person of the Jewish faith. In fact, the latter may not be correct because some Jews do not identify with the faith aspect of being a Jew at all. You may be aware that there are some who use the word Jew as a derogatory term, but it is our name, and we are proud to be called Jews as Christians and Muslims are proud to be called by their names. It's important to understand that Jewish identity does not fit neatly into any one singular category: religion, ethnicity, culture. Some people identify as Jews who do not practice the religion, but identify with the culture and or Jewish values like tikkun olam, repairing the world, or tzedakah, giving to charitable causes, or b'tselem Elohim, that human beings are made in the image of God. People can convert to Judaism, so it's not simply an ethnicity, nor does it necessarily relate to one's DNA. Some describe Jews as a people. You can't tell if someone is Jewish by their last name or by how they look. If you consider the modern state of Israel, for those Jews who live there, it can even be a national identity. The world Jewish population is only about 15 million, the vast majority of whom live in Israel and North America. But Jews live all over the world, come in all colors, and speak many languages. And at this point, we're going to just show a short video to illustrate that. So some of the terms that you may or may not have heard of before and which were on the screen that describe Jews are Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Mizrahi, Ethiopian Jews, who are also called Beta Israel, and Ugandan Jews, who are called Abba Yudaya. There are Jews in India, there are Jews in China, and here in America, there are Jews of every ethnicity that you can think of. Most Jews in North America are of Ashkenazi descent, meaning their ancestors immigrated from Eastern or Western Europe, mainly in the late 1800s or early 1900s, as did my ancestors. But Jews were already here in the 1600s, before the United States even came into being. They settled all over North America in big metropolises and in small towns, and even pioneered out west. Jews arrived in Racine and Kenosha in the late 1800s, and in both towns they established synagogues like Beth Hillel Temple in Kenosha, B'nai Zedek, now Chabad, in Kenosha, and Beth Israel Sinai in Racine. They established cemeteries, charitable organizations, social clubs, and became active and even prominent members of the greater community. Today, the Jewish community is becoming more and more diverse, with as many as 15 to 20% identifying as Jews of color. And the Jewish community is also diverse in its observance, ranging from Orthodox, adhering strictly to Jewish law, to conservative and reform, to name some of the more liberal streams within Judaism. And there are secular Jews who do not connect at all with Jewish observance. We are also diverse in our political views and our socioeconomic status. Being Jewish in America has meant for many, but not all, assimilation into American culture, but also maintaining our unique practices and observances. Our holidays and weekly Sabbath observance follow a calendar that is out of sync with the rest of American society. And many Americans are not familiar with these practices and customs. We're used to walking to the beat of a different drum and often have to explain ourselves. Many Americans are interested to know and understand us, but our differences invite others, sometimes out of ignorance and sometimes out of intolerance and malice, to view us as other and subject us to various forms of derision, scorn, and violence. This brings us to the need for our program this evening. Now I'm going to turn it over to Allison Hayden of the Jewish Community Relations Council of the Milwaukee Jewish Federation.
Thank you, Rabbi. As she said, I'm Allison. I work for the Jewish Community Relations Council at the Milwaukee Jewish Federation. The JCRC builds strategic relationships to protect Jews and defend Jews individually and as a community. We have friends, we have neighbors, allies. We work to be advocates, which my director will speak to you more later about. But one of the things we do is raise awareness to our issues. And one of my jobs is to monitor anti-Semitic incidents and compile a yearly audit of anti-Semitic incidents here in Wisconsin. So I'm going to go over just a very brief history and features of anti-Semitism, and then we'll hand it over to our director to go through our current trends and speak about intolerance and some strategies for combating anti-Semitism. So what is anti-Semitism? Well, it's the belief or the behavior that is hostile towards or discriminatory of Jews as a religious, ethnic, or racial group. It is not the hatred of people who happen to be Jewish, it's the hatred of them because they are Jewish. The JCRC has been tracking anti-Semitic incidents consistently since 2011. We strive to be accurate and consistent with our reporting. Our audit is of the whole state of Wisconsin, though we do have the biggest concentration of incidents in the Milwaukee, Racine, and Kenosha area, as that are some of our biggest Jewish communities, as well as Madison. And every year, we use these trends to see what it feels like to be a Jew in Wisconsin, what it feels like to be Jewish and to deal with these issues. We also share our information with national organizations such as the ADL, and later David will speak more about that. So, there's a lot of history that I could tell you about anti-Semitism, but I'll try and keep it brief. It's as old as the Bible. As soon as we were forced out of Judea and into the diaspora, we became the other. We were no longer worshiping a single God. Jews didn't send gifts to Egyptian temples, go to festivals for multiple gods, refused to work on the Sabbath. And during this period, we became known as Yehudim, or Jewish, which separated us out as different. But it wasn't until the separation of Christianity from Judaism that led to serious anti-Jewish attitudes. As we all know, Jesus was Jewish. Some even called him a teacher or a rabbi. And Christianity was originally seen as a sect of Judaism, with a lot of Christian believers still going to synagogues. It took a few generations, maybe about 200 years after Jesus' death, for it to finally separate from Judaism. Over these many years, what started as a disagreement between brothers and sisters became a disagreement between two different religions. Mixing in the politics at the time of the Roman Empire and the power struggles, we were left with an antagonism. Thus, it was the early church's interest to institutionalize blaming the Jews for crucifixion of Jesus, despite it being Roman authorities who ordered and carried out the majority of the crucifixion. And to paint Jews as the source of evil because we rejected the truth of Jesus. It went beyond just because they were foreign, but being a perpetual malicious entity. And the Passion story, which is relevant as of coming next week with Easter, invented this conspiracy that characterized Jews as elite, Jewish manipulation, and control of political power and evil intentions. And these became the core elements of anti-Semitism. And they show up far, far away from the church in the Passion story. But ultimately, it demonizes Jews, became this means of explaining an otherwise inexplicable situation, such as the Black Plague. History is filled with actions that is fueled by this hate. Aside from physical violence, there were edicts that barred Jews from citizenship, from owning land, from marrying Christians, serving in government, joining various professional guilds. And throughout history, Jews have been expelled from multiple countries. There were massacres and forced conversions. Our entire history is littered with stories of Jewish communities being ethnically cleansed and murdered by people who accused them of scheming, money grabbing, subverting the good of their own countries for their own purposes, and causing whatever ill happened to be plaguing a society. In the late 1800s, things changed on how this was viewed. As the concept of race became more important with the rise of eugenics. Wilhelm Marr was a 19th century German journalist. He argued that Jews were racially distinct from Germans and could never be assimilated into German culture. He said they were dangerous, alien, and intent on maliciously destroying German society. He rejected the previous use of the word Judenhass, Jew hatred, because he hated anyone, even with Jewish ancestry. So even if you had converted, he saw you as being a Jew. So he wanted a word that was racial and quote-unquote scientific connotations rather than religious. So the word antisemitismus is what he chose, a hatred of people of the pseudoscientific category. Semite was the word that he coined, and he coined it to mean specifically the hatred of Jews. Anti-Semitism relies on the idea that there are certain physical and intellectual differences that exist between groups, and that these differences are somehow biological, permanent, and irreversible, even if you've converted out of Judaism. Because they believed falsely in these differences between so-called race, they saw it as justified by modern science to be anti-Semitic. And they were convinced that this science justified discrimination against Jews. And this is what led into the Nazis' beliefs in anti-Jewish laws. Additionally, the Nazis were inspired by the Jim Crow laws in America, when also enforced similar discrimination based on race. And these both will become some of the building blocks of Nazis' Nuremberg laws and the actions that led to Jews being murdered during the Holocaust. A lot of anti-Semitism is perpetuated by stereotypes. Even something that might sound like a complimentary stereotype, like calling someone, oh, you're so thrifty and frugal about that, can come off as problematic and offensive. The ideas of Jewish control and power, things like saying George Soros owns all of the media, or as puppet masters who behind the scenes are using their greed and their divided loyalty to plot and connive against their countries. These stereotypes play into many conspiracy theories that are still alive and well today. And in recent years, unfortunately, we've seen a lot of them resurge. Just as you can see this flyer, which was one of the ones spread here in Kenosha, as well as in multiple states. If you can read it, it says every single aspect of the COVID agenda is Jewish. And it proceeds to list multiple CEOs and other important people in the COVID and pandemic related world, and saying that it is somehow a conspiracy that Jews are controlling it. It states that this old view that blaming the Jews for creating or profiting from the pandemic is somehow the same trope as Jews spreading sickness like the Black Plague and profiting on others' suffering. So why the Jews? Well, on one hand, it's on the ready, it's easy. There's a built-in language over thousands of years, and it's an age-old hate. It has been developed, and it has been even easier to access since the creation of social media and the internet. We see that disinfected people have only to spend a little bit of time online to develop a full vocabulary and a complete narrative about the Jewish conspiracy. We saw a lot of that developing through first QAnon, starting as a conspiracy and picking up anti-Semitic tones. As you see on the quote, David Nienberg wrote, "Ever since St. Paul, Christianity and all religions born from it, Islam and the secular philosophies of Europe, learned to think about their world in terms of overcoming the dangers of Judaism. We have these really basic building blocks for thinking about the world and what's wrong with it by thinking about Judaism." It's also very malleable. You can take a Jewish conspiracy and twist it to fit just about any situation or any issue that plagues you. As Yossi Klein Halevi said, what anti-Semitism does is turn the Jews or the Jew into the symbol of whatever a given civilization defines as its most loathsome qualities. In short, Jews have been assigned whatever is most hateful to that particular society. For a wide example, in communism, the Jews were the capitalists. Under Nazis, the Jews were the race contaminators. There's so many different examples. And finally, it's this view that Jews are a puppet master. It's this convenient way to explain society's ills, a conspiracy theory in which we play the starring role in spreading evil in the world. Emma Green wrote, "In a world sketched by white supremacists, Jews hover malevolently in the background, pulling strings, controlling events, acting as an all-powering force, backing and enabling other targets of their hate." So like I said, that doesn't go into the full details, but just a smidge. So I will now hand it over to our director of the Jewish Community Relations Council, Kai Gardner-Mishlove, to tell us.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having us today to talk about this very important topic of anti-Semitism and what we can do to counter it and some of the national trends. And I'm going to talk about some of the local trends right now. Every year, as Ali was saying, we conduct a anti-Semitism audit. So we're going to go through some slides about some of that data. So our current data is from 2020 because the 2021 data is still being collected and recorded. So the FBI tracks incidents recorded as hate crimes, while the ADL, with my colleague over here, David, tracks incidents that have occurred nationally, both criminal and non-criminal. So the Wisconsin data from 2021 shows a minor decrease of about 4%. 95% of these incidents were reported and corroborated incidents. Now, please remember, as we're looking through this, this is only a snapshot of anti-Semitism in Wisconsin that was actually reported to us. Keep in mind that some decreases should not distract from the overarching upward trend of incidents, specifically the 459% increase in reported anti-Semitic incidents from 2015 to 2021. So there was an 80% increase of incidents among middle school and high school students. Many of them were direct harassment of Jewish students in the form of Holocaust comments, gestures, swastika, graffiti. Unfortunately, incidents in schools are often underreported, but we're working, very hard to provide resources to schools and to the districts and to the students. So as you can see, this is an example. Teens in a Snapchat group sent videos to a Jewish teen stating, "Face the wall, Jew. Congratulations, you finally found your chance to pull your victim card." How does it feel? High school student wrote, "Burn the Jews" on a whiteboard. This is all very concerning. So each year, as you can see, there's Holocaust denial and minimization. We deal with people in our state who attempt to deny that the Holocaust ever happened, or they minimize the numbers, or explain it, in a way to even blame it on the Jews, often framed in some sort of intellectual way. But it's still hatred, and it's masking hatred. There's an idea that Jews exaggerate the horrors of the Holocaust in order to gain victimhood, and that somehow Jews have power over white Europeans and Americans. Many comments like this were left on articles and posted on Facebook after our Holocaust education mandate bill was passed last year. So if you're looking at some of these comments, remember, they are a tiny oppressed minority with no power. What is this, a bill to ban history and teach their story instead? Ever wondered why they keep pushing the lie? And someone calling our Holocaust mandate as the indoctrination bill. And over here you see the pictures, "Happy Holocaust." I mean, these are the comments that we got when we were announcing that this bill had been passed. So, I want to remind you that Holocaust denial has always been clear-cut as anti-Semitism. But we keep seeing this, and it becomes more and more dangerous. In 2021, we saw an increase in minimizing the scope, the impact, and the severity. During the pandemic, which we're hopefully coming out of, but during especially the onset and in the middle of it, we saw a lot of comparison of the mask and vaccine requirements and the lockdown to the Holocaust, oftentimes for political gain or for opinionated statements. So although individuals are entitled to their opinions on public policies, making false equivalencies in this way minimizes the Holocaust, and it opens the door to Holocaust denial and other dangerous forms of misinformation and insensitivity and blaming of folks, scapegoating of folks. It's dangerous because it's very insensitive to the memory of those who perished, and also it's insensitive to the survivors and the descendants of those survivors. There are millions of people who suffered under Nazi rule. Much of this is disseminated on social media, with YouTube being the biggest offender, then Twitter and Facebook. But you can also see that there are, supposedly scholarly works that minimize and deny the full scope of the Holocaust. So as you can see here, these are some of the COVID anti-Semitism comparisons that we can see where people were protesting against vaccines, and in a way using the swastika. We even saw that one of our representatives was stating in response to vaccine requirements that the Gestapo wants to see your papers. This is this is egregious, this is horrible. So now with the start also of the global pandemic in 2020, there were a lot of conspiracies that came out alleging Jewish or Israeli involvement with spreading or creating COVID-19. And in 2021, we saw an increase in these conspiracies on social media and flyers. They pull off the same age-old tropes of Jews poisoning the wells to spread the bubonic plague, the Black Plague, which Ali referenced in her presentation. So overall, there's been a general increase in open and public displays of hate, especially personal harassment and threats to Jewish individuals. When something bad happens to people, people tend to look for scapegoats to explain what they can't explain, someone to target. It's easy for folks to fall into, oh, the Jews, yeah, that makes sense. If they weren't anti-Semitic, it's a familiar mindset to fall into because it's the building block of hate. Anti-Semitism is one of the oldest forms of hate. It is the oldest form of hate. And this becomes rhetoric for centuries, and as Ali was saying, throughout millennia we've seen this. Now, we've seen it across the spectrum from the left to the right. It takes different forms, it's malleable, it changes form, and it leads to violence. So as we could see what happened at the Tree of Life Synagogue, what we saw, that was a synagogue that was organizing for refugees and immigration in support of it. And the person who walked into that synagogue started shooting, this horrible crime because he thought the Jews were behind immigration policy, were behind refugee policy. So one thing I want to say is that while the left is more institutionalized about Jews being white oppressors, people with power, beneficiaries of privilege, there's a twisting of history. People are only good at anti-Semitism on the opposite side, but it's important that we widen our perspective to our own circles, to call out when we see it from our peers. So to quote historian Dr. Deborah Lipstadt, who is now our anti-Semitism envoy, the existence of prejudice in any of its forms is a threat to all of those who value an inclusive, democratic, and multicultural society. Anti-Semitism flourishes in a society that is intolerant of others, whether they be immigrants or racial or religious minorities. When expressions of contempt for one group become normative, it's virtually inevitable that similar hatred will be directed at other groups. So now I want to talk to you a little bit about the process of othering and intolerance. So what we saw in Kenosha and what we continue to see in Kenosha and other areas of the country, these sort of flyers that are separating Jews from other people. And in that process, it becomes easier to persecute that group, or you set that group up for discrimination over persecution. So the process of othering affects all groups. That's one thing I want to say. And I want to say also that anti-Semitism is everyone's problem. It's not just the problem of one community. It's not just the problem that's affecting the Jewish community. It affects all communities. Because remember, it's the basis for a lot of bigotry that affects other communities as well, and hate. So, and there are intersections between anti-Semitism and bigotry and racism. Jews sit in multiple communities, of which we've spoken about a little bit, and anti-Semitism is everyone's problem. Othering leads to individuals and communities being not valued equally in society. This leads to discrimination, which leads to also violence. Some examples of that othering are, such as what Ali was saying earlier, examples of people saying that Jews were rich or were somehow crafty behind anything from the civil rights movement, that's a modern example of folks saying that Jews were behind the scenes and the cause of unrest in our society. Another example, when we're looking at other groups, Asians as being behind COVID. If you remember at the onset of COVID, there was a lot of blame, and it was even called the China flu. This is an example of othering a group so that you can persecute them or you don't see them on equal level with yourself. We've seen it in the past, Haitians being responsible for AIDS or HIV. And I bring up these examples to show you that othering of one group can lead to othering of another group. It's very important for us to recognize it and for us to call it out. If you're sitting at your Thanksgiving table, if you're in the lunchroom with your coworkers and you hear negative things about a certain group, you should speak out. And I hear a lot of negative things about various groups, especially if it's perceived that I'm not a part of that group. So it's very important to not back down, to speak out when you can, and to encourage, whether it's within your place of employment, within your place of worship, that we call it out. Now, these are some of the strategies I want to talk about also briefly. And some of it I've talked about. It's important that we be reactive and proactive in this process. You condemn hatred of all forms. You hold your leaders accountable. If you have leaders who are stating things that are anti-Semitic, that are bigoted, it's important to call them out on that. You educate your community, and at the JCRC and at our Milwaukee Jewish Federation, we do a lot of education regarding bigotry, regarding building bridges, regarding what anti-Semitism is, what the Holocaust is, and how we can prevent this from happening again. It's very important to know each other. We live in a society that's very polarized, and often we don't know each other. We don't know who someone is who's not like us. So what can we do to build bridges between communities? You know, who's in our circle? Are we expanding our circle so that we're communicating and learning about other communities? It's very important, and at the JCRC, we take that very seriously, that it's important in order to protect our community and protect other communities. We have to build bridges between communities so that you open up dialogue and you learn about each other in ways that you can support each other. Remember that we have a common cause. The common cause is to fight anti-Semitism, is to fight bigotry, because that provides for a safe society for all of us. If one of us is unsafe because of what's happening in society, all of us are going to be unsafe. We form alliances against hate. If there's hate that's emerging in another group, you stand up for that group. And so our Jewish community has been very active over so many years, whether it was the civil rights movement, whether, you know, the women's rights movement. We've always been at the table. So we're asking now for other communities to step up and support us also. And the last thing I'm going to say is look around at your space, the spaces that you interact in, the spaces that you work in. Is it welcoming? Is it affirming? Is it positive? Are you welcoming of all people? Are you welcoming of us? And by us, I mean our Jewish community, us. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry, I forgot about this. This is an important thing. At the JCRC, we conduct this audit. Where we analyze incidents over the years. So it's very important that you report all anti-Semitic incidents that might occur to us and at our email, jcrc@milwaukeejewish.org. We handle all of Wisconsin. Even if you think something, you're not sure if it's anti-Semitic or not, it's important to contact us anyway so that we can help you figure out that piece. Some folks have minimized what we would consider anti-Semitic. So it's very important that you do discuss that with us. For tolerance and anti-bias resources, we have an Hours Against Hate program, and you can see the website right up there. That is a program under our Jewish Federation, under our JCRC, and basically it's a program where we have various programming to address building bridges, addressing hate, addressing ways that we can have dialogue about things and learn from each other. Also, our Holocaust Education Resource Center has Holocaust education resources. Remember, I mentioned that we have a Holocaust education mandate that was passed last spring, so they are busy working in making sure that school districts know how to teach about the Holocaust. Unfortunately, they could not be here tonight, but they assisted us with, you know, a lot of the programming for tonight. So if you'd like to learn more about them, you can go to holocaustcentermilwaukee.org. And also, for more information on our Milwaukee Jewish Federation, please go to milwaukeejewish.org. Our JCRC is a committee under the Milwaukee Jewish Federation, so you will find a tab that has information about our programming, and you can also follow us on Facebook at JCRC Milwaukee, and please do that. Yes, and I also want to introduce you to Leah, if you could raise your hand back there, Trottenberg, who is an advocate for the Jewish Family Services, which is also one of our partner agencies under our Milwaukee Jewish Federation. She is available to assist victims of anti-Semitic incidents and also connecting folks to resources in the community. So we love Leah, so make sure that you take a card from her if you can. And now I'm going to pass it to Ari Friedman, who is our Director of Security and Properties at the Milwaukee Jewish Federation. We work closely with Ari in addressing anti-Semitic hate in our community. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kai. So my role is to oversee the security acumen of Jewish organizations throughout the entire state. We have about 40 different organizations between synagogues, schools, community centers, Hillel student centers. And I often joke with Kai that like her job is to put me out of business, which I would love to happen someday. So I've been asked today to address security in the faith-based communities and how it's changed over the recent years, specifically within the Jewish community. What brought us all here together today was the distribution of anti-Semitic flyers. These types of incidents are what I consider to be a gateway drug to much more serious crimes. Unfortunately, over the last few years, our community, the Jewish community, has seen a huge increase in pure violence. Whether it's been a shooting at a kosher grocery store in New York, an edged weapon assault at a Hanukkah celebration at a rabbi's home in New Jersey, or a synagogue attack perpetrated by a 19-year-old man in San Diego who was inspired by a mosque shooting in New Zealand, or as Kai spoke about, the tragedy in Pittsburgh, and most recently, a hostage situation in Colleyville, Texas. This list goes on, and it's not unique to the Jewish community. We've seen countless acts, similar acts, at churches, at mosques, in our own backyard at the Sikh Temple in Oak Creek. I've served as the security director at the Milwaukee Jewish Federation for 13 years. And during the first part of my career, our response to crisis was almost exclusively reactive. We'd get information about something happening and we'd react to it. A perfect example was in 2017 when our Jewish Community Center received 4 bomb threats over a 2-week period. At that time, we had a security acumen in place. We had cameras and access control and all the things we'd want to have for security. But bomb threats weren't something that was on our radar. And we had to scramble to react to it, to keep our community safe, and almost equally important, having that feeling, that comfort of security. So after that occurred, we promised ourselves we would do everything we can not to be in that position again. So we needed to learn quickly how to be more proactive. So I'm going to talk about a few things that we're doing over the last few years that we hadn't been doing up until recently. So one of the things we've done is we've taken our security guard program to kind of the next level. Almost every synagogue in the state on Sabbath has security at their synagogue. We provide synagogue security grants to roughly 25 locations throughout the state. We've added full-time security at many of our schools, and we've had to have security at many of our Jewish communal events. Almost all of them. And the reason we have to do that is because we just don't know when bad things are going to happen. Additionally, in the last year or two, we've looked at technology to help us become more proactive. We work with an organization called SCN, the Secure Community Network, which was set up to oversee and assist with Jewish communal security in North America. What we do, one of the tools we use with them is a cyber intelligence tool that allows us to provide them with the names of our physical assets, our synagogues, as well as our human assets, like our community leaders. SCN enters these assets into a database, along with some keywords that might demonstrate that there might be a threat against these communities or these assets. And this has actually come into play. There was an active shooter threat made on a website called 4chan this past, right before our high holidays. This intelligence software picked it up, and we were notified, and we were able to react accordingly. We were able to prepare in advance for this type of threat. We've also utilized federal funding through the Federal Emergency Management Agency's Nonprofit Security Grant Program. Last year, Wisconsin received $4 million that was given out to multiple faith-based organizations, as well as other mission-based nonprofits. There's much more that we've been doing along the way. One of our goals is that every member of the Jewish community is trained in how to respond to an active threat. And frankly, I think everybody should be trained for that. We want people to recognize how they're going to respond physically and mentally to these things and give them the tools to counter them. Run, hide, fight, which some of you may have heard about. And this is not only a great tool in houses of worship, it's also good in everybody's everyday life, in a restaurant, movie theater, kids' soccer game. We need to empower our communities. The last thing is perhaps the most important, and that is the need for better awareness and better information sharing. The best thing that we can do to protect ourselves and our faith-based communities is to have an aware citizenry. It's a force multiplier that provides additional sets of eyes and ears. Now, I'm not asking everybody to become hyper-aware and suspect or be suspicious of everybody that you come across. That's not healthy, and that's not what our communities are about. But some common sense, especially today, when we're seeing these things happen, it's our job as faith-based leaders, as community leaders, to get the word out, to provide resources so that people can become more aware and more empowered to commit to action when these things are occurring. The message I want to leave you with today is simple, and it's one that you've probably heard before. If you see something, say something, and do something. We never want information to stop with us. We need to call out all acts of hate, anti-Semitism, racism, sexual orientation bias. This is where we can begin making our world more secure through a culture of safety and security. It starts with the people in this room and the people that you know. If you don't call it out, if you don't do something about it, who's going to be there when it happens to you and in your community?
And at this time, I'd like to introduce Alderman Jack Rose, who's here representing the city of Kenosha.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. What I'd like to share with you this evening is a resolution that we passed unanimously at the City Council meeting this past Monday. Sponsors Mayor John Anaranian, and it's in support of Kenosha's Jewish community. Whereas on January 15th, 2022, a man held Jewish worshipers in a Colleyville, Texas synagogue hostage for 11 hours. And whereas we stand in solidarity with the congregation, Beth Israel community in Colleyville and the entire Jewish community. And whereas, according to the Anti-Defamation League's most recent audit of anti-Semitic incidents, assault, harassment, and vandalism against Jewish people remain at near historic levels in the United States. Whereas this pattern of violence against Jewish people includes the 2018 attack on the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where 11 worshipers were killed in a deadly anti-Semitic attack on a congregation in Poway, California, the following year. And whereas the incidents on January 15th, 2022 are a reminder that we must continue to educate ourselves, speak out against, and prevent anti-Semitism and hate locally, nationally, and globally. And whereas city administration has been made aware that anti-Semitic materials have been distributed when the city of Kenosha 5 times since December 2021. And whereas everyone has the right to pray and practice religion safely, and whereas the city of Kenosha is committed to a safe, inclusive, and just society, and whereas a safe, inclusive, and just city has no place for hate against specific groups. Now therefore be it resolved that the city of Kenosha, mayor and common council condemn anti-Semitism, discrimination, racism, hate, and violence, and stand in solidarity with our Jewish community members. Be it further resolved that the city of Kenosha, mayor and common council affirm our commitment to creating a safe, inclusive, and just city where religious groups are able to practice their religion freely and safely. Be it further resolved that the City of Kenosha Mayor and Common Council make clear that Kenosha must be free of anti-Semitic actions and a place where we are committed to supporting the wellness of our Jewish neighbors. Be it finally resolved that the City of Kenosha Mayor and Common Council stand in solidarity with our Jewish community as we strive to make our city a safe, inclusive, and equitable place for all. Signed, Mayor John Anaranium. Thank you.
Okay, this is on. Hi, I'm David Goldenberg. I'm the Midwest Regional Director with the Anti-Defamation League. ADL was founded more than 100 years ago with the mission to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to ensure justice and fair treatment for all. I'm based in Chicago. Our Midwest region, though, is Illinois, Indiana, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas. So it's kind of a nice little swing there through the Midwest. We also have offices, though, in the greater Midwest, in St. Louis, in Detroit, in Cleveland, and in Omaha as well. So when I use some of the data points and I'm talking about the Midwest, I'm talking about Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and the Dakotas, not all 12 greater Midwest states. If we included them, by the way, this presentation would be less uplifting than it already has been. So to let everybody know. So when Kai asked me to come to come present, she asked if I could talk a little bit about anti-Semitic attitudes kind of and broader national trends as well. So I wanted to start here with ADL for the last 40, 50 years actually has been conducting what we call our Global 100 survey. This is a survey of anti-Semitic attitudes. It started off, we did it in the United States, and it has then spread to now we do it more than in more than 100 countries, in native languages, etc. Now, as you can imagine, you can't pick up the phone and call someone and just say, hey, are you anti-Semitic? And they go, oh, yes, and you can count them that way. So we have to ask questions that go back to those ancient anti-Semitic tropes that Ali was talking about a little earlier to get a sense of how do people feel. So questions like the question of dual loyalty. Jews are more loyal to Israel than the country wherever they may be. Jews have too much power in the business world, in government, in media, too much control, etc. And so when we look at these 11 questions, which are the same questions we have been asking now for 50 years, which tells you how sad of a conversation we're having here, if they answer yes or likely yes to at least 6 of the 11, we categorize the individual as having anti-Semitic propensities. So let's take a look here. I have a wonderful presentation when we look at other countries, but for the sake of time, we're just going to focus on the United States. Now you can see here, is there a pointer here? I don't know if you can see. This one here? Yes. Oh, that's not the right button. Not the right top button. Big middle button. Oh, there we go. Okay. So if we look here at back in 1964, all the way on the far left, you can see we're sort of the watershed level at 29%. Again, these are people who said yes or likely yes to 6 of the 11 questions. Now, if you go then see, so you're talking here in the middle of the Civil Rights Movement, moving down to the 1992, if you remember there was a Great Recession in 1992, as Ali was talking about, who kind of do you blame for your lot in life? That was something you saw. But then when you start getting here into the late 90s, all the way through 2019, which was the last year, you're generally about level. And yes, we go from 12 to 17 to 11. If you think about polling, the margin of error is usually 3, 4, 5%. So we're generally pretty level for most of the last 20 years, which begs the question then, as Kai was talking about incidents, why are we dealing with that? And I'll come back to that question in just a moment. To break it down a little bit more, this is from our survey back in 2019, so just a couple years ago. Still in America, this is in America, in the United States, still 27% polled believe the Jews were responsible for the death of Jesus, despite every major Christian denomination coming out and saying it's just not true. 24% Jews are more loyal to Israel than America. The charges of dual loyalty are quite common. They've been common in the United States, whether you're talking about Japanese internment, now you're dealing with Jews in Israel. 19% is Jews talk too much about the Holocaust. Kai talked about the Holocaust mandate here in Wisconsin. 15% Jews have too much power in the business world, and 11% Jews have too much control over the U.S. government. These are trends, these are opinions that existed just a few years ago. So let's talk about where we are from an anti-Semitic data perspective. So these are anti-Semitic. ADL tracks harassment, vandalism, and assault. We track incidents that come into us, and we also work with our partners at the JCRC to make sure that between the two of us, we didn't miss anything. And at the end of the day, too, we work very closely in responding to incidents depending on what it may be. Now, nationally, 2020, and by the way, in the next month, we'll be coming out with our 2021 survey, and I can't talk about it, but what I can tell you, though, is anecdotally, in our office in the Midwest, we reached the number of incidents that we responded to in all of 2021, on Halloween was when we reached the total number that we had responded to the previous year. So you can assume where you can see where the numbers are going to go and reach your own conclusions, and you'll see it in the press in about 3 or 4 weeks. But still, 2017, 2019, and 2020 have been 3 of the 4 highest numbers of incidents that ADL has tracked since we started tracking these in 1978. To give you a sense of how the world has changed. And so that data point that Kai showed earlier that showed that there was just a slight increase, but the real question is, like, what do the last 5 or 6 years look like? In the last 5 years, 59% increase nationally, and in the Midwest, those 6 Midwest states that I told you, 84%. And by the way, it'll be over 100 when our numbers come out. I'm not supposed to share, but that's what it's going to be. It's pretty bad. So some of the key findings that we found is that there was a from 2019 to 2020, there was a 40% increase in incidents targeting Jewish institutions. 9% of those involved references to Israel or Zionism, and 16% of incidents were committed or inspired by extremist groups. Now, we might say 16%. Is that a lot? Is that a little? What I look at it is that conversely, is that 84% of those incidents were committed by people who have no direct ties to extremist groups and organizations. So these acts of anti-Semitism are being committed by the average person. And so when you also talk about the work that Ari does and the work that SCN and ADL does, when you're trying to find almost that needle in a haystack before the incident occurs, you think about then that haystack gets a lot blurrier when you think about these incidents. And when you look at those incidents of Colleyville, or you look at the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh, or the shooting in Poway, or Halle, Germany a few years ago, or Christchurch, none of those individuals were card-carrying members of extremist groups, keep in mind. These were people who were inspired by these ideologies online, and that they felt that they needed to take action. But again, they weren't card-carrying members of a hate group. Now, one thing I do want to point out is that there was a reference to the vandalism that was done a few years ago at Beth Israel Sinai down in Racine, or up in Racine, excuse me. That incident, it was actually committed by or organized by a white supremacist group called The Base. ADL worked with the U.S. Attorney and Milwaukee Federation and SCN and the FBI. Ultimately, it turns out it was a network that came out of South Jersey that ultimately went after a synagogue in Western Michigan and also here. And so they tagged the Base graffiti, but these are incidents, and likewise those flyers are being pushed out by a white supremacist group, a fledgling new one called the Goyim Defense League, which is based out of Texas. We've tracked probably at least 70 cities where we've seen those incidents. In Milwaukee, we've seen them up in the Madison area. We've seen them in some of the Milwaukee suburbs. We've seen them in La Crosse. And so these are occurring all over, and this is unfortunately all too regular occurrence. Now, one of the things that I want to point out, and I'm going to be quick finishing this up because I know I'm probably running out of time, is Kai had a really important data point that showed the increase in incidents in K through 12 schools. In the Midwest, so here's the thing, so ADL from 2018 to 2020, we tracked a 19% increase in incidents in K through 12 schools. And as Kai mentioned too, when you know there's an incident of anti-Semitism, odds are there's other incidents of hate or bigotry or bias that are occurring in that same school. In the Midwest, in our 6 states, somehow is a 55% increase. Now, I'd like to say maybe we're just better at tracking it in our office, but we're not that much better. And it doesn't, so it begs the question is, are all these kids anti-Semitic? Or all these kids bigots? I don't necessarily think so. But what it tells me, though, is that they're experimenting with hate in ways that they have never experimented before, in ways that are much more public, at least I should say this, not ever before, but in ways that they haven't experimented with in many years. And so we at ADL looked at our anti-bias education programs, and we were reaching about 25 to 35,000 students and educators a year in our 6 Midwest states. A year ago when this data point came out, I said, how do we get to 500,000 on an annual basis? And we put our minds to it. We reached 70,000 last school year. We're probably going to reach around 160,000 this school year. And we're going to keep pushing because by the end of the 2024-2025 school year, we've got to address this problem in a real significant, meaningful way. So I'm going to wrap this up to kind of put this also in the context of other forms of hate. So as you can see, this is the FBI data, and as I think Kai mentioned, the FBI is typically about a year behind, so they won't come out with the 2021 data until Thanksgiving, maybe a little bit earlier. But as you can see here, our watershed height in 2001, we see the dip. We see around 2016, with this, actually dating back to about 2014 was the low point, or yeah, I think 2014 low point. We're now back up to a 20-year high in 2020. Now to break it down too, race and ethnicity accounted for over 60% of all reported hate crimes. You can see religion was a close second, and then, not a close second, excuse me, not even close second, sexual orientation behind then, and you can see kind of how it continues. This one right here breaks it down of race and ethnicity. As you can see, always, throughout the history of the tracking of hate crimes, anti-black hate crimes have always been the far majority of hate crimes as it relates to race and ethnicity. And you can see lower numbers too. When we look at hate crimes motivated by religious bias, they accounted for about 15% of all. Anti-Jewish bias accounted for 55% of all single motive hate crimes. And you can see in this particular case, anti-Jewish hate crimes have been up and down, but they've always been the most by far. You can see the anti-Islamic hate crimes. You can see the dramatic spike in 2001, the terrorist attacks of New York, and you can see other increases as well. You can see a dramatic spike also in 2015 and 2016. You can, and also I think as it relates to here in Wisconsin, you can see in 2015 the FBI started tracking anti-Sikh attacks as well. And so this doesn't necessarily paint a rosy picture, but I think it's important to understand all of them. And so I'll end with this because we're here on a college campus, and it reminds me of this story. So these wealthy donors invite a bunch of students from the campus that they support out to their estate. And in the back of the estate, lo and behold, there's a beautiful lake out back. And they're sitting there, and they say to these students, listen, in the middle of the lake, there's a rock. And in the middle of the rock, there's sitting a turtle. And the turtle can't get out. The turtle is stuck because the lake is filled with piranhas and alligators. So, what we're willing to do to one of you students, if you're able to get to that rock, get that turtle, and bring that turtle safely back to the shore, we'll give you whatever you want. You want wealth, you want a job, you want whatever you could possibly imagine, we will make happen. They look at the students, sit there for a couple minutes, no one moves, complete silence. The couple turn around, start walking back into the home. As they turn around, they hear, and they look around, and there's this student darting back and forth in the lake, zigging, zagging in between the piranhas and the alligators, gets to the rock, stands up on the rock, looks down, picks up the turtle, takes a deep breath, jumps back into the lake, zigzagging, bobbing and weaving in between the piranhas and the alligators. Finally gets to the end of the shore, climbs out at the end of the shore, dripping wet, stands up as the couple comes running around the side of the lake, and they go, that was amazing. You saved the turtle. What is it that we can do? What can we give you? The student looks there dripping wet, takes a deep breath, shrugs his shoulders, and goes, I just want to know who pushed me in the lake. And it reminds us that as we're talking here about incidents of anti-Semitism and other forms of hate, it's really important that, some of us up here, we get paid to jump into the lake. That's what our jobs are. We jump in head first. We chose to do that. But for most of us, we find ourselves in the middle of the lake. We find ourselves in the middle of a situation. And so, as Kai said so poignantly earlier, what do you do about it? Are you going to speak out? Are you going to share facts? Are you going to show strength with those who are victims? Because each of us makes a decision as to whether or not we're going to jump into that lake. And so I really appreciate the invitation to come and speak with all of you, and I'll turn it back over to Kai.
Thank you. We're going to do Q&A. Oops, sorry. Sure. I can do it. You can stay. Okay, we're going to, this is the Q&A portion of the program. If you want to raise your hand, and I will come over to you to ask a question. Okay.
Well, I want to make some comments. I don't think that the anti-Semitism started with Christianity. That was an intellectual dispute until Constantine adopted Christianity as the official religion of Rome. They could not do that very well and blame themselves for the crucifixion. So guess who got the blame? So I think that's where that really came from. Eugenics was once very commonly practiced in the United States. At county fairs, they used to exhibit people as examples of good breeding in the same way they exhibited livestock. I think that's interesting. Yeah.
Thank you. We'll come back to you. I want to make sure everyone gets their chance. Anyone else have a question or comment? I think, didn't you have your hand raised? No? Okay.
I had a question for David, Kai, if that's okay,
Sure.
from the ADL. Do you know what the JAB group is that dropped the most recent literature here?
So they are, from my understanding, the core of where those flyers are coming are from the Goyim Defense League, which is based out of Texas. They started it. Some of you may have seen, there was a more high-profile incident that occurred with a neo-Nazi group in the Orlando area. This was probably 2 months ago, maybe it was December. And born from that, not this Goyim Defense League was not born from it, but they then took sort of the mantle of they were going to spread the propaganda into different communities. There have been smaller groups that kind of start more locally, and when I say groups, by the way, most times I'm talking about like 2 or 3 people, right? And so it's hard because you can't really find a roster. The most recent time that any type of hate group where there's been a roster, some of you may have seen this. There was a leak, the Oath Keepers, which is one of the 2 organizations that ADL has joined with the Washington, D.C. Attorney General to sue for the insurrection on January 6th of last year. There was a leak and 12,000 of their names were released. And, you know, we've gone through it. We have notified local law enforcement. Unfortunately, in just about all 50 states of people who have ties to it. But this smaller group, we think is just something, I don't want to go so far as calling it a copycat group or whatnot, but it's our understanding it seems to be some type of smaller pocket, but that they're not creating their own stuff, shall we say. At least we haven't seen it.
So I know he's referring to JAB, which is, there was a flyer, Jews Against Bris. Bris is a ritual circumcision, but we think this group was alleging that Orthodox rabbis were pedophiles. So that's another form of othering and spreading misinformation and racism, really, you know, and anti-Semitism. Did you have a question?
Is there a recommendation, conventional wisdom, best practice about what people of goodwill in interfaith coalitions or institutions of higher learning are supposed to do? What would be the most helpful thing to do? And are there things that are known to backfire, that could be well-intentioned but have the opposite effect of what is what they desire? And how could you advise us if we want to make a supportive statement or protect our Jewish brothers and sisters in Kenosha? What should we do and not do?
Well, I was going to say, first of all, in interfaith coalitions, it's very important to partner with your interfaith brothers and sisters and stand up for them. So some of the things that have happened that I know, for example, with the Interfaith Conference of Milwaukee, folks have spoken out against anti-Semitism. So I think it's important that in your judicatory or in your faith group to, when they're at the pulpit, whenever there's a homily or something, depending on what your faith practice is, to speak out against it, if that is your platform. And also, call up your partner in your interfaith coalition who's affected. What can we do to help you? I think it's very important to ask the group what they need for support, in addition to sort of like the other things that you would normally do to support someone who's under attack, such as, speaking out against what's happening. Do you want to answer?
I'd echo everything that Kai just said. What I would also add is, for me, I often think about the gut check is when something bad happens, like who calls? And it's sort of a gut check of really how strong are your relationships. And sometimes it's it can be as simple as like, hey, I saw this just happened. What can we do? We're here with you, that kind of a thing. What ADL kind of buckets it into 3 areas. Number 1, speaking out. So it's important to speak out against that incident that occurred. To share facts. Often these pieces of literature that are distributed and others are just so bogus and off the mark. And also when you hear different things in a setting, whether it be at the Thanksgiving dinner table or around the water cooler or wherever it might be, saying, that's not really what it is. And what you just said, that's how it affected me, right? And then the third one is to show strength and to find opportunities. What I would say is reaching out and saying, how can we be helpful? And that often, it's usually the first thing that I do whenever I see a community that's been a victim. And even in the Jewish community from ADL, I'll call the rabbi and say, my synagogue, I live in Highland Park, Illinois, just north of Chicago. My synagogue got a bomb threat 3 weeks ago. And, and it happens, I live 2 blocks away from the synagogue. We happen to be out of town. But before even ADL spoke out or did anything, I called the rabbi and I said, what do you need? And he just said, just make sure that, if you can make sure law enforcement's paying attention to it. We used our relationships with law enforcement. We called the FBI, called the police chief. They were already on top of it. But basically he was like, just make sure we're responding. So sometimes it's just asking the person, I saw that happened. And if it's a more personal setting, one-on-one basis, what can I do to be helpful? And then the last piece that I will say is JCRC and ADL, both of our websites have some great educational resources. So ADL for free, we have things like what we call table talks. So parents or family members who want to have conversations with people, but you don't quite know how to guide the conversation, especially with young people. We have curriculum on K through 12 schools on a variety of issues, and when things happen, we update the curriculum so it's up to date. And that stuff is all free. And so those are some resources also that you can bring into an academic setting, maybe K through 12, but then also we have other learnings for higher education as well.
And something that's more specific to schools, especially like middle school, high school, a lot of those students don't want to tell their parents, don't want to tell their teachers about incidents, especially if it means it's going to single them out if they report it. So you have to understand, a few years ago we had the incident in Baraboo with the prom students that all were doing the Sig Heil Hitler sign, and that went to international news. And we went in trying to offer education, compassion, speaking, but because the students had been so singularly put on blast, so to say, there was a lot of pushback that they didn't want to listen. They felt singled out. They felt that we were unfairly victimizing them. Some of the pushback came from the families, not just the students, and it made it a lot harder to have honest conversations with the students. Whereas a lot of times when we do hear about incidents, we go in and we say, we're not going to put your name on this, incident. We're not going to drag the school, because administrators also don't want their school to be in the news for these things. But we want to be there and have these very honest tolerance conversations, go in with empathy, saying this, some of this hatred comes out of ignorance, not knowing better. We need to have these conversations. We're not here to punish you. We're not here to tell you that you're a bad person. We're here to help you learn and talk through these. And I think sometimes in a school setting, it's easier for people to come forward when we, express that, when we talk through that, versus if they think they're going to tell us and we're going to put their name up on an incident and we're going to drag them around. There are so many incidents for schools that I did not include in our audit other than a number, because I didn't want those students to feel unsafe by their peers. I didn't want those schools to stop talking to us or asking us for information. So it's just very important, especially if you're talking to someone and they say, well, I don't want to report this incident, it wasn't a big deal, or I don't want to be singled out by my peers. Understand that we don't want them to be singled out either, but it is an issue, as David said, in our schools that's becoming worse and worse, and we do need to address it. And if we don't know where to start, then we can't address it.
And I just wanted to add to that, as Allie was saying, the incidents that we collect and we report on, it's all confidential. So you can report an incident confidentially. It's very important to just report it. And also another point that I wanted to make as far as strategies. Think about your family and your friends when you're talking about things. When Colleyville happened, we were hearing things like, oh, that really wasn't an anti-Semitic incident. And later on, it came out that this person was sort of fueled by anti-Semitic tropes, thinking that this rabbi had some sort of ability to get someone who was in jail released, and they flew all the way to Texas, the middle of nowhere, to, get that one rabbi, and then to have that one rabbi call the rabbi in a rabbi in New York to discuss this, as if these two rabbis had anything to do with the person that was in jail. So when I look at that incident, I think about, how can I talk to my family and friends about this? This is an anti-Semitic trope that this person believed in, and we see this time and time again. So I think the more that we talk about it, we see the seriousness of it. And someone had their hand up over here.
Thank you. My question, as someone who lost a very dear friend down the rabbit hole and there's like no hope of him coming out. So my question, it started with media, distrust of media. So how can any organization that works in this get the media to stop spreading misinformation at a national level, at a regional level, something somewhere can stop the spread of misinformation?
Well, I will say this, that for those who didn't see on the news, President Obama was in Chicago yesterday, and he did an interview with the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, and he spent like a good 15 minutes actually talking about mistrust in institutions and how much has changed in the last particularly 10 years, and just the energy that people, I've often found when you disagree with somebody, or you hear somebody tells you something, the reaction has become now people take all the energy, instead of being inquisitive, trying to understand, well, tell me a little bit more why you think that way, or help me understand it. They're just too quick. They're spending all their energy to like tell you why you're wrong, right? And we always experience this in a much more way, and I'm sure it discourages people. And Rabbi, I can only imagine what your life is like on that end. But for us, at least, at ADL, we've launched a new democracy initiative that is aimed at trying to raise awareness about the implications of losing trust in these in government, in the media, in even religious institutions, right? And so for us, we've looked at it in a number of ways. On the individual side, there are some, we used to be able to say, try to help get that person to unpack why they view it that way, and be able to point out why that view might be wrong. So, tell me what you mean by that. Or are you talking about all Jews, or are you talking about one in particular? So the idea of, well, the reason I have this view is because Joe over there did this, as opposed to all. And so that's like one strategy, the idea of that I've tried to use sometimes, where are you is it general or is it specific? Tell me why to help unpack it. As far as those who have kind of gone down the QAnon and the conspiracies, it's very difficult to pull them out. And I don't have a good answer for that one. What I do have, though, is we call them 6 simple strategies, and what I just shared is one of them. Another one, cutting people off before they even go. So someone says, hey, did you hear about those 2 Irish guys who walked into a bar? Well, let's not go there, right? And it could be about the Jewish person or the rabbi and the priest or the whatever you want to insert, right? So that's another type of strategy. Try to block and redirect. And then another of the 6 strategies, and I can go through all of them, but another one that we often encourage people to say is, use the word ouch. Somebody says something to you, ouch. I mean, if you're not 3 years old, when was the last time you used the word ouch, right? And it's the idea of signaling to somebody, you're going to have a stop in that conversation when then that person realizes, you just said ouch. What is that, And so that's another thing, and it often, in that context, it allows you to sort of reset the conversation and say, and also saying, that person, that had an effect on me, and let me tell you what that meant, the impact that it had on me. Even if I'm not Jewish, or even if I'm not whatever, and I don't fit in that group that you just, created a stereotype for. But those are some areas. It's difficult as far as the individuals when they're, as you said, down sort of the rabbit hole. But unpacking it sometimes I find can be very helpful. And that's some of the things, by the way, we teach educators as well. The idea of try to help the kids unpack what they just experienced, because then you can start assessing the effect and the effect, and you can start figuring out what you can do to help and support them moving forward, realizing that it's just really hard.
And I would just add to that, sometimes when you've got folks who've gone down that rabbit hole or they've become radicalized in some way, there are other issues that are going on with them also. So getting them help if you can, some sort of behavioral health services might be worthwhile. Any other questions?
Well, on behalf of the Jewish community of our area and the interfaith community that co-sponsored this, I want to again thank all of our panelists for being here this evening. Some of them came from quite far away to be with us. And want to thank Carthage College again for hosting such an important discussion. Thank you, everyone, and safe travels home.